Is it harder to be a boy in the world today? And how well are we doing at helping boys get ready for the adult world and the men they're expected to become? With us to explore such questions, Dr. Alex Russell, clinical psychologist and the author of Drop the Worry Ball. Rachel Giza, journalist and author of Boys, What It Means to Become a Man. Damon Fairless, journalist and author of Mad Blood Stirring, The Inner Lives of Violent Men. Antique Milan, writer and transgender advocate. Welcome to you all. Thanks for being here.
Yes.
So in the past year, the Me Too conversation has had a ripple effect in many industries. It's brought up a memory of mine when I was younger and watching in the 90s, the Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas scandal. How do you think news about consent is impacting kids in middle school and high school right now? Teek?
Yeah. I think it's having a positive impact. I think that this is a conversation that needs to happen. The Me Too movement has sparked this question of whether boys and men are in crisis. But I think that boys and men have been in crisis. I think there's a crisis of our culture around masculine people. So this idea around consent, I think, has been a really important conversation because so often young boys aren't taught about consent. They're taught about sex. They're taught about the thrill is in the hunt. They're taught about possession and treating sex as if it's a sport, and also that coupled with this idea of entitlement, that boys are entitled to women's bodies, to their smiles, to their attitudes, has really been a powder keg for violence, right? So I think this conversation has been really, really important, and I'm hoping that it's not just us having conversations in the echo chamber, that it's not just us who are involved in advocacy having these conversations, that's not just women and feminine folks that are having these conversations, but men and boys and masculine people are being really engaged and are being really pushed to change their attitudes and to change the culture around consent and around sex. So I think it's been good.
Alex?
Well, one of the places those conversations are happening among youth is in psychotherapy. So, I was talking to colleagues about our panel today, and one of the things I was hearing from a lot of psychologists talking with young men is there is a bit of a crisis around this. There are lots of young men struggling to figure out how to be a sexual man. And how to think about their own sexuality. Boys who have become overly concerned with their own sexual aggressivity, if you will. It's probably a good problem to have. I think they are in a bit of crisis. It maybe is a good thing that there is a bit of a crisis, though, because we have to rethink these roles. But yeah, I think at present there are a lot of young men struggling to know how to be a man.
Do you think, I want to get an answer from you both, but just to follow up on that, but do you think that because these stories of the Me Too era have been about men doing things to women, that there's a little bit of, for boys, it's like an attack. Do you think that boys feel a little bit attacked?
It's hard for me to say with boys because I don't have boys, I'm not around boys. I think a lot of guys are feeling it. I think a lot of grown men are feeling that way. But I kind of echo the notion that, we look at crisis and we think, that's terrible. But there's no character growth without crisis, right? And I think that part of being a fully developed human being, male or female, in this case, man, is accepting the crisis of growth, right? So for me, that means all I think that I'm hearing is being asked is pausing to consider your behavior.
So that you think it's a good way to have this conversation?
I think that it's inevitable that this is happening. It's happening for a reason, and I think that all that's really being asked of guys is to honestly consider their behavior. How big of a crisis is that, really? I understand that you might have an initial reaction of well, you call me bad because I have these natural instincts or whatever, but really what people are asking of guys is to stop and consider their behavior, consider how they're affecting other people.
Rachel?
Yeah, and I would agree with everything, but as somebody I've spent a lot of time talking to young men, and I think there are a lot of boys who feel like they're given a very simple message around consent and one that comes very late. So I think that the message is, no means no or stop this behavior, but I don't think that boys and young men are being given the kind of critical thinking skills and the cultural critical thinking around the expectations around what masculinity means.
So when you say that they're being given too late, we should start earlier?
I think we should start earlier talking about issues of empathy, healthy relationships, physical and personal personal boundaries, self-awareness around what feels good for you, because if you don't establish that for yourself, it's very hard to be there for a partner. I also think we still have a tremendous amount of messaging in our culture that says to boys and young men that men must always be aggressive, boys must always be on. Your value as a man is in having sexual prowess. I also think that within a heterosexual context, there still is a prevailing cultural narrative that girls say no because there's shame around sexuality. So when she says no, she doesn't really mean no, and it's your job to kind of convince her or overpower her or whatever it is. So I think that we aren't doing a good enough job engaging boys and young men early on to expand their ideas about what maleness means, what success and possibility as maleness means, and also how to have healthy relationships starting with friendships, and then as they move on to a romantic and sexual life, to have those kind of skills built in. I think if a boy, I spoke to a sexual health educator, and she said to me that, boys don't feel often that they can say no to the pressure around, having swagger, about showing off sexually. So if they feel that it is imperative for them to behave in a certain kind of way, to catcall, because that makes you one of the boys, to talk about girls and women in sexualized and degrading ways as a way to show your status as a male, then they're getting that message about what it means to be acceptable as a male, and then they're getting another message saying, no, that behavior is wrong, that is assault and that is rape. And I think that boys and young men are caught in this place of having two messages coming at them, and we're not doing a good enough job in helping them see their way through it.
Because I think it's larger than just having this binary kind of thing. It's a more nuanced and more complicated conversation. So it is about policing their behavior, but it also goes into these conversations about valuing women more as objects, as more than just objects, but as full human beings who can also be your friends. Like this idea of the friend zone. Where it's like, oh, you get caught in the friend zone because you pursued a woman and she doesn't like you.
Because you were nice.
Right, because you were nice.
Yeah.
Right, and it's like friend zone. It's not you don't be nice to a girl until like sex pops out. You know what I'm saying? That's not what it is. So I think when we have this culture that is telling young men not to value women unless they are giving something to you, right? Unless they're giving themselves to you, their time, their bodies, then they don't have any type of value. But if we could start to teach our young boys that they can have platonic and loving relationships with women and with feminine folks, teaching them to be empathetic as well as policing their behavior, then we have a more like complex and more complete idea around consent. So it has to be bigger than just a yes or no.
I wanted to read something from your book, Rachel. While girls changed, boys didn't. As girls occupy more spaces that were traditionally the domain of boys, as student leaders, top scholars, champion athletes, boys seem to have developed an identity crisis. If boys and girls are defined as opposites, then what happens when girls are good in school? Does that mean boys aren't or shouldn't be? Does being good at school make you appear feminine? Perhaps the boy crisis isn't about brain difference or an anti-male culture at schools. Perhaps ideas about school and masculinity are what's causing boys to fail. Can you expand on more what you meant by that?
Yeah, so there's been this, when we talk about the boy crisis, one of the areas that's come up is in education. As we've seen girls achieve more and more success, and I'm sort of talking the broadest terms. There's been this sense that schools are failing boys, that schools have become overly feminized spaces that don't value traditional male characteristics. There's been some good scholarship to indicate that from a very young age, boys and girls learn what is deemed acceptable based on their gender. And so,
is that coming from parents? Is that coming from
parents,
schools?
culture, the school? And so there have been, there's one scholar that I talk about who's here in Toronto who found that looking at there's lots of dropout rates amongst Portuguese Canadian students in schools in Toronto. And when the scholar spoke to young men in that community, what they said was they didn't feel that doing well in school was manly, was masculine. And so in lots of ways, they opted out of educational achievement because they were getting messages that it wasn't manly to like to read, to work hard. And also, they were raised with a code around masculinity which says, don't ask for help. So when they did struggle in school, when they felt like they maybe were struggling with reading, rather than going to a teacher and saying, I need help, they felt like I've got to go it on my own. I have to be self-sufficient. So one of the messages built into the message one of the messages built into that idea of masculinity is self-sufficiency. You don't ask for help. You don't show your vulnerability. You don't show your weakness. You always are in control. And so that can play into that can play into why boys struggle sometimes at school, because they don't want to look like they're trying too hard, and they don't want to ask for the help that they need.
And Alex, you help parents, you help students. Is this something that you find in your line of work?
Yeah, well, for sure. And I'm just sort of thinking about some of the comments here. One of the mysteries, I think, and one of the challenges here is that for boys, it's still a big deal to become male, to develop a masculine identity, to be a man. Among boys, it's still a real insult for me if we're boys and my insult is that you're feminine or a woman there's lots of more derogatory words, but they all have to do with saying that you're not manly. Whereas among females, young girls, it's not such a big insult. There's something seemingly about being male that as we grow up, we really have a hunger or a need, or perhaps it's the opposite. We're really desperately afraid that we're going to fail at becoming masculine. And the word is vulnerability. And so that's what we're still struggling with, is helping young men to figure out how to identify as a male and also to be vulnerable.
I mean, in your book, the book that you wrote, you spoke to a lot of men who had maybe taken the wrong path and ended up where they were. And you found yourself having these vulnerable conversations. What did you find in the process of speaking to this men when it comes to being open about what's going on inside?
Well, I think one of the really interesting things about talking to the guys that I talked to is that every guy I talked to, I profiled a lot of guys who had done extremely violent things, from mixed martial arts to serial killing and sexual assault. Every one of these guys had at some point in their life something in them that was essentially afraid. And I'm not saying that if you're afraid and vulnerable, you're going to go do something violent, but there's definitely a link there, because a lot of these guys, I think, in some ways, were compensating for that fear. So, I think we have this, we're taught, and maybe there's a tendency for men to shut down all of these different emotions on our palate, and to shunt your emotions into anger or dominance behaviors, right? So you've got only a few ways of expressing fear, anxiety, self-loathing, worry, all of this whole palette of emotions. And so if you've got a lot of stuff going on in your life, I think sometimes these little holding containers of anger, they bust, and people do crazy things.
And also in the book, you mentioned that some of this behavior began in boyhood. So what do you think was the most important lesson that you learned in the process? Because you also share your story of being in a violent place and also feeding off that energy that you got because you were extremely violent.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's really complicated, because there are certain aspects of, if you're violent in a certain way, and the way I've been violent is by interjecting in fights and beating up bullies.
Which is a good thing, but...
Well, I mean, it's a good thing to confront bullies.
Yes.
I never needed to fight. But it's an incredibly, I think, inherently reinforcing feeling to be able to, especially if you've been bullied, as I had as a kid, to take down a bully, to turn the tables. So that's really reinforcing. It's also a real high. Like, it feels great. It feels really good.
Because you're the hero, you're the good guy.
But also, I mean, there's a ton of adrenaline, and it's a real testosterone reinforcer, and you're dominant. And if you stop a bully, you get a lot of props for that, right? So it's socially rewarding, it's biological rewarding, it's rewarding psychologically, but I think that we also have to have a conversation about how to manage that feeling, right? Like, it's normal to feel good if you're confronting a bully, but I was kind of going off and doing this for kicks, because it was fulfilling me in some weird way. And I think that we have to have a conversation with boys before they're starting to do, or as they're starting to encroach into violence and dominance behaviors, about, like, well, why are you doing that? What's actually going on under there? It's cool to feel the fear and anxiety and the fear of the pack or whatever. That's normal. Everyone feels that. And you can deal with it in all these different ways.
But I guess, do they know that everybody feels that?
No,
right?
no.
You wanted to add something?
I'm just thinking, just thinking about that, how, as a transgender man, I was constantly looking for examples of masculinity to model, right? And I'll be honest, I couldn't find any that felt good for me, that a lot of it felt really compromising, or it felt too violent, or there was so much shame. It just feels like in our culture, everybody says, masculinity is so fragile and it's kind of become this thing, but there's a lot of truth to that, because there's so many things in our culture that can tear down masculinity instead of things that can fortify it. Like things that tear down masculinity, something, as surface as like the color pink, or like liking a female pop artist, or being vulnerable, or having fear. All of these things that just make you a human being make you less of a man. And then there's only this really small pocket of things that says, oh, you're a man. If you're angry, or you have a lot of lust, or you have all this bravado, or you know what I'm saying? And so many young men don't fit in these little boxes. I travel throughout Canada, throughout North America, sharing my story as a trans guy, talking about different modes of masculinity. And afterwards, I always have a Q&A. And usually have no boys ask any questions. They wait until I'm in the back, and I'll have a line of them. And then they'll come and they'll talk to me, and they all have anxiety that is perpetuated by their friends. And that got me thinking when you were saying how, young boys are, lagging behind in school, and they're saying, well, their spaces become more feminized. But this is a way in which that we how we are putting the onus on women and feminine folks, when what's happening is, the reason that this is happening is because we as men and masculine people are perpetuating this culture. Oftentimes it's the brothers and the fathers and the friends that are telling these boys to man up and punching them instead of hugging them and telling them, go
Moms
get the girl.
do that,
and
though.
do that.
Moms do that. I've been on
Yes, that's true.
playgrounds. I've been on playgrounds, and I once heard a mom tell her child not to be the P word.
Yeah.
And to get up and stop crying.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's fair to just say it's all.
I don't. Yeah, that's true. I think mothers definitely do that. I see this in community all the time, where women will raise their daughters and love their sons, and coddle their sons. That happens, but that is a part of kind of this patriarchal kind of society that we live in. That was created by men, and these are women who are holding on to this power as a way of aligning themselves with
because
that.
they probably think that this is a way for their children to be safe in the world.
Right, and it's not.
And one of the things I just want to add, picking up something that you said, Alex, as well, is that there was a study I came across. There's an organization in the U.S. called Promundo, which is a global organization that works with boys and young men, engaging them in gender equality. And they did a study in 2017 called The Man Box, where they looked at a group of young men in the U.S., UK, and Mexico, and asked them how much they adhered to very traditional definitions of masculinity. So being stoic, being aggressive, being the breadwinner, all of those things. And the men who most identified with those very traditional values, the ones that most embodied it, had status amongst other men, but they also had the highest rates of depression. They were also more likely to be engaged in violence, either as victims or perpetrators, and they were most likely to want to control girlfriends and women in their lives. So not only did this have a social impact on the quality of their relationships, they were also experiencing really high levels of depression and isolation. So these qualities about being a real man are not emotionally healthy.
Well, this is what I was going to add.
Yeah.
I was going to add this. Suicide is one of the leading causes of death for young people 15 to 24. So beyond the social, what we expect to be the social norms, how much of this is a health crisis?
Yeah, well, that's why I'm so glad you raised that point, Rachel, because as you're saying, not all young boys fit into this hyper-masculine model, but Rachel's pointing out, even the ones that fit it, it's not good for them.
No.
It's really helpful to see that, and that sort of there's a kind of an equation here. If we look at this prevailing more macho, or just a short format idea of masculinity, it means to be vulnerable, is to be weak, is to be feminine, is to be female, and all of that is humiliating. There's this kind of a package that goes together, and it's easy for the dominant men to adopt that mentality, and they don't suffer from it because they're winning, but they are suffering actually.
So is this a health crisis, would you say?
I would, yeah. But as as we're talking about, it's a crisis, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. We're having this crisis because we're trying to rewrite gender roles that have existed for literally thousands of years. I mean, the great majority of societies have been patriarchal. And we're trying to get a truly egalitarian, equal culture where we're trying to redefine what male and female means. And they probably mean something different. Like, I wanted to put that in the conversation, that we're looking for equality between the sexes. But that doesn't mean men and women have to be the same.
Right.
And I think we're struggling to figure out how to do that.
Yeah, and I think it's really more about like equity rather than like equality, because everybody doesn't need the same thing. But what do we need specifically as like differently gendered people, in order to bring us to a place where we have like this kind of egalitarian type of makeup?
I want to show you a clip of a panel discussion we did last year on the portrayals of Black masculinity in film. And this is actor Jonathan Nathaniel talking about the limitations of what it is to be a man.
It's a mask. And underneath it, there's this person who's trapped and imprisoned, unable to express himself, and able to be honest with who he is and authentic. And I think that's the real issue here, is that we're sort of not allowing our sons and our boys to express themselves and to be soft and tender and to have feelings and to, be caring, which are sort of feminized by our culture and considered unworthy. And that's the problem. And there's this bottled up rage and anger that we see, and depression that we see these kids lashing out because they don't have these outlets, because they're not allowed to.
So he says it's a mask. He's wearing a mask. He's performing masculinity. With Teak, do you think boys' experiences today are even it's even more complicated because of the immediacy of social media?
Definitely. I definitely think it gets more complicated because of social media. And yet men and boys are constantly wearing these masks all day. But then we have social media. You're looking at your Instagram. Instagram is just the highlight reel, Everybody's just showing like the best parts of their life. And so you have this spirit of competition that is entrenched in like masculine culture, right? And so you're constantly looking at your Instagram or your Facebook, and everybody's showing you the best parts of their life. And so now you're constantly trying to compete with that and not really able to like deal with the things that are happening internally. So I think it has a huge effect. And also, just going back to what you were saying, and also in the clip when they were saying how like being caring or being soft has become feminized and not valued. I think when it gets down to like the core of it, this is about learning how to value femininity and feminine people, and understanding that being a man and being masculine isn't necessarily the opposite of femininity. These are things that have to work in tandem and work together. And having these traits that are considered feminine isn't a bad thing at all. Some of the most intelligent, the bravest, and strongest people are women. And I think there are so many men that can say the same thing. So many men who are raised by single mothers or in families that are very like matriarchal, or, everybody in their life who has ever really like cared for them and given to them have been women, whether they're teachers or their mothers or their aunties or grandmothers. But at the same, so you have that, and then you go out into the world and they tell you that none of that is valuable. Only thing that makes you a man is this little small pocket of things, So I think we have to start to pull back and start to have serious conversations with men and boys about femininity, about valuing femininity and the feminine people in their lives, and understanding that it's okay. It's nothing to be scared of, and it's nothing to hate.
Yeah, no, and I really like that, and I think maybe I'm saying the same thing differently, but it also is, in addition to devaluing the feminine, we're also neglecting and devaluing the masculine, in the sense that like we're saying these things are masculine, but you got all this stuff under the hood, all of these emotions and interests and possibilities. Right, but you have to shut them down and just focus on those things, right? So it's in some ways too, it's neglecting. There's a lot of neglect, right? We're amputating certain parts of ourselves that we can actually share with people who are feminine, and make ourselves more enriched, right? Just by being. Right?
Sorry. Well, I also think that, because often when I talk about this, I'll have, people say, well, like I get called like a man hater a lot on this subject, and or that I'm advocating for a kind of masculinity, or I'm opposed to sort of, that masculinity is bad. And I don't think that is true. First of all, I think there's many masculinities. I also think that we can look at traditional sort of masculine qualities or characteristics and think about ways to not have them be toxic and harmful. Right. So I think leadership, like that leadership is, often traditionally associated with maleness. I think we can just say leadership is a great quality for all of us. Yeah. What does it mean to be a good leader? What does it mean to be a caring leader? What does it mean to, or when Damon was talking about the kind of heroics of standing up against bullying, that is a lovely quality to teach a child to stand up for somebody else and stand up for themselves. How do we do it in the ways that isn't the old Hollywood Hollywood model of the hero, you know, charging in on his white horse and rescuing the maiden. How do we think about what does it mean to stand up for justice in a way that can create pathways for boys and for girls and for everybody that kind of says these are great qualities. Let's take the weird negative associations around it, or let's take the fact that the belief that this is only a male thing away from it, and say to boys and young men, you can be a leader, you can act in ways that are heroic, you can be strong, you can have physical endurance, you can play sports, and you can do all of that, but you don't have to bring the baggage of and the stuff that's not good for you and not good for society along with it into those traditional male realms.
What I find interesting, what you just said, you said so many great things, but before you said you've had pushback.
Yeah.
Why do you think you've had pushback to what you're saying?
Honestly, because I'm a woman. I mean, David and I, who are we're friends, and you know, we speak together a lot, and I think there's a sense of I should not talk about men.
So how do we, because we can have these conversations here and amongst ourselves, but how do we, if we're in a state of crisis, how do we talk to each other instead of at each other?
Yeah.
You know, for me, if we're going to think about this very practically and think about the influences on young people, we're thinking about social media and so on, I can't help but take a moment to think about parents' influence on children.
Yeah.
And just to think about how easy it can be for parents inadvertently to play into some of these more stereotypical dichotomies. You know, especially around, if we think about masculinity, it goes together, we've been talking with kind of lust and power and aggression. You know, there's certain professions where if you get hired at the big firm, the pay structure is, it's called eat what you kill. Right? You know, now I run a psychology practice. I hire mostly women. It's true. It's a caring profession. But if I was hiring a new associate and I said, in our model here, in our psychotherapy practices, you eat what you kill, it would be a bizarre. It would just feel bizarre, right? So you know, just there's this sort of these different mentalities, and like the caring professions are still equated with the feminine, and like and to value caring is a huge shift that we have to make. We keep coming up with that word, and caring and the females have been equated for a long time, but that's not working for the new male. Like, you're a dad. I've been like, you haven't slept in 4 years, as I understand, right? Because and then your baby sleeps right here. I heard you say. Right?
She used to once you were younger,
so you know, like we're a caring, nurturing group of men too. So learning to really value the caring roles in society, the early childhood educators, the teachers, the nurses, and so on. You know, that has to happen, and parents need to be aware of how easily they can denigrate those roles because they're not high paying, because they're not eat what you kill sort of mentality. It's just, and I just, if parents who are watching, just to be aware of that and be careful of your language and be careful of what's in your mind.
Well, I've heard this expression a lot. Oh, when my husband takes care of the kids. Oh, he's taking care of the kids. I'm like, they're his kids. He should be taking care of them.
Babysitting.
So the language.
Like to the dad, are you babysitting? Are you babysitting?
Because that takes
kids?
away from the role of the father. And
Yeah.
Teak, you're a new dad.
Yeah, and I've gotten that a lot. Are you babysitting your kids? It's like, no, I'm taking care of
What do
my
you mean
child. You know?
babysitting? Yeah.
You know, let me tell you a story. I'm on social media a lot, right? Now, when I have my baby, when we're out, I wear her. You know, I wear her because she loves it. She likes to look and kind of like touch everything. And I was on Twitter, and I think it was Pierce Morgan had tweeted a picture of the guy who played
Daniel Craig.
Yes, and he was wearing his kid, and he said something like an assault on masculinity. And you know, even though you know I'm here and I'm in it, that kind of I was like, wait, does this mean?
I think we're at a point now where like Piers Morgan looks dumb doing that. You know, like,
But there are a lot of people, I think, who have that idea.
For sure,
So for you, when you saw that, did you for a second think, oh, I shouldn't wear my baby?
No, I didn't go there, but I thought like,
really?
I thought, is that what other men think of me when they see me with my kid? You know, because I have had guys kind of look at me, kind of like look away or like snicker. Like I've seen it before, and I'm just like, my kid is awesome. Like, you know, she loves this. You know, but it made me sit and think like, wow, is this what people are thinking of me? Is this in their eyes, am I less than a man because of all the care that I give to my child, you know? And I'll say it did affect me. So, you know, I had to sit with that for a minute and say, if it had this little bit of effect on me, what does it say for like younger guys who are vulnerable, who aren't in these spaces, who aren't having these conversations, who aren't really well versed around like the complexities around masculinity? What is that saying to them? Is he gonna go back and tell you know, his wife or whomever, like, I'm not wearing this kid anymore, or I can't change any diapers, or I can't do anything because it makes me less of a man in the eyes of everybody else? themselves. And what I'm learning is that so much of masculinity, how men define themselves as men, is predicated on what other people think, right? It's all about what happens outside instead of inside.
I don't think it's very different from the effects that women have. But I think something that you said in your book with friendships, and we were talking about in the green room, it seems that women have different friendships than men do.
Yeah.
And in your book, you write about the importance of friendships for boys. How important is it for boys to develop solid friendships?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's critical. I mean, we know that friendships and those kinds of intimate bonds where you have a support network of people, even just a couple, are inoculating against depression.
benefits are huge.
Massive.
Yeah.
We know that that boys have very powerful friendships with other boys when they're younger. By the time they get to middle school and high school, those friendships become less intimate, more superficial. They become and yet boys still crave that connection.
Is there a reason why it
I think
changes?
it's social pressure. I think that there is a homophobic fear of having, for straight boys, of having too much intimacy with another male. I think you'll see that, friendships between boys where there's a lot of physical affection, that physical affection disappears when they get older. I think, again, for fear of looking, if they're straight boys or even if they're gay boys, of being outed as gay or looking gay. Whereas I think that, girls and young women can still share a bed or hold hands or put their arms around one another. And again, we know touch is really important for one's mental health and one's well-being. I hear from boys and men all the time how desperate they are for intimate male friendship. There is a hunger and an appetite for real conversation, for real support networks. And a lot of men and boys do have them. But again, I think that there is something in our culture that says men should not have intimacy in that kind of way with other men. They can have intimacy with their female partners, or if they have intimacy, they must be gay. But I think for a lot of straight men, they feel that that is not acceptable for them to have that kind of closeness. Where I think a woman wouldn't think twice about saying that she calls her best female friend a couple times a day. They're constantly texting,
Or even shares the same bed without
exactly.
any-
Whereas I think a lot of men would feel like, I think that they would be judged. Or they would feel a bit embarrassed. And I think a lot of men would love to be texting their best male friend during the day.
We only have a few minutes. We only have a few minutes, and I want to get into this clip. Vivek Shraya, the author of I'm Afraid of Men, talks about her fear of men as both a man and now as a woman. And she had to say this about her book. Let's take a look. Why do you think this book has connected with so many different people?
That's something I've been trying to figure out, to be honest. I mean, at my most optimistic, I'm like, wow, this is a wonderful moment of progress, and that, finally people are interested in narratives that aren't white, that aren't, quote unquote, cisgender or straight, that we're interested in, an intersectional perspective. At my most cynical, I worry that part of what's happening is that women who've been largely the readers of this book, there's something validating about having someone who used to be a man say the things that women feel and have felt all along. And so I worry that the undercurrent of what is making this book successful is actually patriarchy.
We're going to actually play Vivek's interview after this interview. Damien, you read the book. What did you think of Vivek's book?
I told her I thought it was, I really connected to the fears she was talking about. So I kind of initially had a little bit of the knee-jerk reaction of being like, I didn't do anything bad. That kind of like, and she's talked about that people remember the book as I hate men, not I'm afraid of men. When I read it, I totally connected to this notion of being afraid of my peers. And so I told her, I responded differently than she did. I built this garrison out of, as I got older and became, and physically developed as a man, as a very male body.
It's so surprising to hear you say that. I don't want to interrupt because you, I think, not to objectify you, but you seem to be like the ideal version of what a man is. You're tall, you look the way you look, but you've been afraid of men. You felt afraid.
And I think if you, I ask my friends, my male friends this, I think if a lot of men will tell you this if maybe under the cone of silence, but I think that why do guys go crazy lifting weights? Why do guys study martial arts? Why do guys get big trucks? Why do guys get guns? Why do guys do all the guy things? That's armor.
Yeah.
That's building a garrison of manhood, which is great because it does and can protect you I feel more confident now than I did when I was 12 because I'm a 250-pound man who can carry his own weight. But you're alone in the garrison, right? You're alone up there in that tower, watching out, watching out. That's not a healthy state to be in. And I think that a lot of guys, I don't necessarily know how many guys will acknowledge that. They might take issue with what I'm saying. Oh, I'm not afraid. What are you talking about? You're a wimp.
Well, there we go.
I mean, well, no, but I mean,
So it comes full circle.
That's
So
the dynamic.
we have 30 seconds. Rachel, I'll give you the last question. How do we combat this? We have a lot of Gen Xers and millennials raising children. We were raised by baby boomers. How do we confront this?
I think having more conversations like this, I think that we are beginning to have these conversations and engaging it and talking about it. And I suspect there are a lot more people who think about these issues the way that the group of us here and want to have these conversations and want to engage in this. And I think we also have to, not view this, I say in my book, as a zero-sum game. This is not men against women. This is not a binary thing. That this is like the project of gender equality. Like we all need to participate in it because I think we all have something to benefit from opening up and pushing back, like opening up these barriers, opening up this garrison. We all have something to benefit from that.
And allowing our children to know that they have a voice and we're here to help them.
Totally.
Thank you very much. We've run out of time. We really appreciate all of your insights. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.